Over the past 18 months, American diplomats have traveled to Beirut with remarkable frequency, more often than to nearly any other capital in the Middle East. Yet during this same period, Lebanon has not drifted toward Washington's orbit. It has moved measurably closer to Tehran's. This isn't a story of diplomatic incompetence. It's something more puzzling. Washington understands Lebanon's strategic weight perfectly well. This is the only Mediterranean state where Iran maintains direct military presence through Hezbollah, a force more capable than most national armies in the region. Losing Lebanon would sever Iran's land corridor to the Mediterranean and isolate its most powerful non-state ally. America knows this, and it has responded with a coherent three-part strategy: economic reconstruction packages, support for political realignment, and implicit security guarantees designed to give Lebanese factions an alternative to Iranian patronage. On paper, the logic is sound, but here's the contradiction. Iran isn't matching American resources dollar for dollar. It isn't outbidding Washington in reconstruction funds or deploying comparable diplomatic capital. Tehran is operating under severe economic sanctions, managing internal unrest, and stretched across multiple regional conflicts, yet it's winning. How does a sanctioned, economically constrained regional power outmaneuver the world's superpower in a small country where America apparently holds every advantage? The answer isn't found in Tehran's strength or Washington's weakness. It's found in what this case reveals about the changing nature of power itself and what it exposes about assumptions that no longer hold in 21st century competition. To understand why America's Lebanon Gambit was likely doomed before it began, we need to examine not just what Washington is offering, but what it fundamentally misunderstands about how power works in the Levant. America's Lebanon strategy operates across three distinct dimensions, each designed to address a different aspect of Iranian influence. The economic component centers on reconstruction financing and institutional reform. Washington has backed proposals to facilitate IMF restructuring of Lebanon's collapsed financial system, supported infrastructure projects aimed at rebuilding state capacity, and explored targeted easing of sanctions-related banking restrictions that have paralyzed Lebanon's economy. But each offer comes with conditions: political reforms that would dilute Hezbollah's institutional power and reduce its veto over government decisions. The political dimension focuses on reshaping Lebanon's fractured landscape. American diplomats have quietly supported Lebanese factions willing to challenge Hezbollah's dominance, remnants of the March 14th alliance, technocratic reformers who emerged after the 2019 protests, and Christian political parties seeking to reclaim influence. Washington has encouraged electoral reforms and backed presidential candidates acceptable to Western and Gulf partners, attempting to build a governing coalition that could operate independently of Hezbollah's consent. The security element involves strengthening the Lebanese armed forces as a credible counterweight. This includes border security assistance, training programs, equipment provisions, and implicit security guarantees designed to give the LAF confidence to assert control over territory Hezbollah currently dominates. These efforts fit within the Biden administration's broader Middle East framework of de-escalation and integration, reducing direct American military involvement while building regional partnership that can contain Iranian influence without Washington's constant intervention. The strategy intensified following the catastrophic August 2020 Beirut port explosion, which destroyed much of the capital and accelerated Lebanon's economic collapse. As the state disintegrated, American policymakers saw opportunity. Regional partners joined the effort. Saudi Arabia and the UAE offered financial support contingent on political change, while France leveraged its historical ties to coordinate international pressure. This isn't minor diplomacy. It represents significant American investment in reshaping Levantine power dynamics. On paper, the strategy addresses every dimension of statecraft: economic, political, and military. It leverages America's traditional advantages, financial resources, international institutional influence, and alliance networks. So why is it failing? The answer lies in what this strategy assumes about Lebanon: assumptions that ignore 30 years of Iranian strategic preparation. Iran's entry into Lebanon following Israel's 1982 invasion was not opportunistic, it was calculated. While the world saw chaos, Iranian strategists saw an opportunity to establish strategic depth beyond their borders. The Revolutionary Guards didn't arrive to simply arm another militia. They came to build something far more resilient. Hezbollah was designed from the beginning as a comprehensive socio-political military organization, not just a fighting force. Through the 1980s and 1990s, it functioned as a resistance movement against Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, but it simultaneously built schools, hospitals, and social welfare networks in areas the Lebanese state had abandoned. When Israel withdrew in 2000, Hezbollah didn't disband, It claimed a political mandate as the force that had liberated Lebanese territory. The 2006 war became a legitimacy-building watershed. Hezbollah fought the Israeli military to a standstill, becoming the only Arab force in modern history to do so. That military credibility translated into political power. After 2008, Hezbollah secured constitutional veto authority over government decisions, formalizing what had already become reality. No major policy could proceed without its consent. This wasn't accidental. Iran's strategic philosophy centers on redundancy. Hezbollah provides social services the Lebanese state cannot deliver. It operates an independent economy parallel to Lebanon's failing formal system. It maintains military capabilities that dwarf the national army. And it holds political power through constitutional mechanisms that make its removal legally complex, perhaps impossible, without fundamentally restructuring the state. Each attempt to reduce Iranian influence has paradoxically strengthened it. The 2005 Cedar Revolution following Rafiq Hariri's assassination temporarily reduced Syrian-Iranian presence, but the subsequent political crisis led to the 2008 Doha Agreement, which formalized Hezbollah's veto power. The 2006 war, intended to weaken Hezbollah militarily, instead validated its resistance credentials. The 2016 to 2017 Saudi attempt to pressure Lebanon through Prime Minister Saad Hariri backfired completely, humiliating Riyadh and demonstrating Hezbollah's institutional entrenchment. Iran learned from each challenge. After every pressure campaign, it made Hezbollah's position more resilient, more embedded, more difficult to extract without collateral damage to Lebanon itself. By the time Lebanon's economy collapsed in 2019, the depth of integration became undeniable. As the state disintegrated, Hezbollah's parallel structures didn't just survive, they became more essential to the populations they served. The organization that began as a militia had become inseparable from Lebanon's institutional fabric. This history reveals something critical that American strategists consistently underestimate. Iran didn't build an alliance in Lebanon, it built an architecture. An architecture designed over 3 decades to survive exactly the kind of pressure Washington is now applying. Understanding this historical foundation allows us to see why each element of America's current strategy faces a structural obstacle that tactics alone cannot overcome. The problem isn't execution, it's conception. The economic trap. Start with America's economic offer, reconstruction financing, IMF assistance, infrastructure investment. The underlying assumption is straightforward. Economic relief will empower Lebanese factions willing to reduce Hezbollah's influence, creating political space for change. But Lebanon's economic collapse has produced the opposite effect. It has strengthened Hezbollah's position. While the formal economy crumbled, Hezbollah's parallel economic network became more essential. Funded by Iran, sustained by illicit trade networks, and supported by diaspora remittances, this system operates entirely outside Lebanon's failing state institutions. As banks closed and the currency collapsed, Hezbollah continued paying salaries, distributing fuel, and providing subsidized goods to its constituents. The worse the state's economy performed, the more valuable Hezbollah's parallel system became. The IMF restructuring Washington supports requires banking transparency and financial sector reforms. These measures would expose Hezbollah's financial networks, threatening the infrastructure that sustains its operations. Hezbollah will block these reforms regardless of economic cost, because accepting them represents an existential threat. More fundamentally, economic leverage assumes the Lebanese state controls resource distribution, but Hezbollah operates outside state structures. Offering money to a bankrupt government to influence an organization that doesn't depend on that government is structurally incoherent. You're trying to starve an entity that grows its own food. The political strategy faces an even deeper problem. Washington supports anti-Hezbollah factions and demands constitutional reforms that would limit the organization's veto power. But Lebanon's confessional system, designed to balance sectarian communities, gives Hezbollah's Shia constituency structural political weight. Constitutional changes require supermajorities that mathematically cannot exist without Hezbollah's consent. America is essentially asking a democratic system to democratically vote away one community's primary political representative. This is a logical impossibility dressed as policy. History confirms the pattern. Previous attempts to isolate Hezbollah politically between 2005 and 2008 led to street violence, government paralysis, and ultimately the Doha Agreement, which formalized the very veto power Washington now wants removed. Pressure didn't weaken Hezbollah's position. It legitimized it. The deeper issue is simpler. America's political strategy requires Lebanese Christians and Sunnis to confront Hezbollah without equivalent security guarantees. Washington is asking local actors to take mortal risks. It won't backstop militarily. No rational political faction accepts that bargain. The security paradox. The security component reveals the starkest contradiction. The plan is to strengthen the Lebanese armed forces as a counterweight to Hezbollah. But the LAF cannot become stronger than Hezbollah without triggering civil war. And if it remains weaker, it isn't a counterweight. It's irrelevant. Consider the balance. Hezbollah possesses over 130,000 rockets, maintains combat-hardened fighters with recent Syria war experience, and operates advanced military capabilities that rival state armies. The LAF has roughly 80,000 soldiers with limited heavy weaponry, outdated equipment, and crucially, no appetite for sectarian conflict. A significant portion of LAF personnel are Shia with family connections to Hezbollah. America cannot provide weapons that would genuinely threaten Hezbollah without risking their eventual seizure or defection to Hezbollah, creating a worse security situation than currently exists. And Israel would never accept an LAF powerful enough to challenge Hezbollah because such an army would also threaten Israeli security interests. The strategy assumes you can build a neutral national force stronger than a motivated ideological militia embedded in its own community. History suggests this is extraordinarily rare, approaching impossibility. The alliance contradiction. But the deepest problem cuts across all three dimensions. America's Lebanon policy directly contradicts its Israel policy. Washington wants Lebanon to control its territory and constrain Hezbollah. This requires empowering the Lebanese state with real sovereignty and genuine military capability. Yet Israel views a truly sovereign, militarily capable Lebanese state as threatening. Conversely, Israel's periodic military operations against Hezbollah infrastructure inside Lebanon Washington tolerates or supports undermine the very state institutions America claims to be strengthening. Each Israeli strike validates Hezbollah's core argument that only resistance, not the state, can defend Lebanese territory. America is simultaneously trying to strengthen Lebanese sovereignty and maintain Israeli freedom of action inside Lebanon. These are mutually exclusive objectives. Regional partners recognize this contradiction. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, burned by previous investments in Lebanon that produced no strategic returns, are increasingly unwilling to commit resources without guaranteed outcomes that cannot be guaranteed. The real game, these obstacles aren't independent problems. They're interconnected features of a single structural reality. Iran designed its Lebanon strategy to be resilient against exactly this kind of state-level pressure because Iranian strategists anticipated it decades ago. They created an organization that provides what the Lebanese state cannot: services, security, political representation. They built systems that operate outside the frameworks where Western leverage works, international banking, formal economies, transparent governance. And they embedded Hezbollah in constitutional structures that make its removal legally and politically nearly impossible without civil war. America is playing a 20th century game of state-to-state influence in a 21st century environment where sub-state actors with committed external support can be more resilient than the states themselves. These aren't minor tactical obstacles that better diplomacy could overcome. They're structural contradictions embedded in the strategy itself. The implications of this strategic failure extend far beyond Lebanon's borders. What happens in Beirut reverberates across the region and signals important shifts in the balance between traditional state power and asymmetric resistance networks. Regional domino effect. The immediate consequence is strategic, not tactical. If America cannot dislodge Iranian influence from Lebanon, the most pluralistic, Western-connected, economically desperate country in Iran's sphere, what realistic chance does it have in Iraq, Syria, or Yemen, where conditions favor Tehran even more strongly? Regional actors are drawing exactly this conclusion. Saudi Arabia has initiated direct diplomatic engagement with Iran after years of hostility. The UAE maintains pragmatic working relations with Tehran, despite nominal alliance with Washington. Even Israel has quietly shifted its strategic posture from elimination to deterrence, accepting that Hezbollah cannot be removed, only managed. The failure validates Iran's resistance axis model to every group watching. The lesson is clear: build multidimensional networks embedded in local populations, develop parallel economic systems, and maintain commitment over decades. If you do, even superpowers struggle to dislodge you. This template has direct implications for Hamas in Gaza, Iraqi militias, the Houthis in Yemen, and potentially future organizations elsewhere that seek to resist external pressure. The sanctions erosion. Lebanon connects to a broader pattern: the declining effectiveness of economic sanctions against adversaries who adapt. When sub-state actors develop parallel economies with external support networks, traditional sanctions become less decisive. Hezbollah operates outside the international financial system Washington controls. It receives direct transfers from Iran, manages illicit trade networks, and relies on community support structures that formal banking never touched. Iran has taught its partners to build resilience into their economic models from the beginning. This lesson is being studied carefully by Russia, China, and other states seeking to resist Western economic coercion. The unipolar moment of the 1990s assumed economic interdependence created leverage. That integration into Western-dominated systems made countries vulnerable to exclusion. The multipolar reality demonstrates that determined actors can build alternative systems that function outside those frameworks. The integration illusion. The Lebanon case exposes fundamental problems with America's broader Middle East strategy. Washington's vision involves normalizing relations between Israel and Arab states while marginalizing Iran, creating a regional architecture from which Tehran is structurally excluded. Lebanon shows why this cannot produce stability. Iran has built physical presence and developed local legitimacy that cannot be wished away through diplomatic frameworks designed without its participation. Any genuinely stable regional order must either accommodate Iranian interests or accept sustained conflict as permanent condition. Current American policy does neither. It pursues integration that excludes a major regional power with demonstrated ability to disrupt arrangements made without it. The result is unstable equilibrium rather than durable architecture. Alliance credibility questions. The failure raises uncomfortable questions about American commitments. If Washington cannot protect a small country from Iranian influence despite significant diplomatic effort and resource investment, what does this signal to partners elsewhere facing pressure from regional rivals? Allies in the Gulf, Eastern Europe, and Asia are watching. The Lebanon case reveals a pattern. America's difficulty converting economic and technological superiority into decisive political outcomes against committed adversaries willing to accept greater costs and sustain longer timelines. The new great game. Lebanon's significance extends beyond the Middle East. Beijing is studying how American influence fails despite apparent advantages, lessons directly relevant to Taiwan, Southeast Asia, and other contested spaces. The takeaway: if you embed yourself in local structures, build parallel systems that don't depend on Western-controlled infrastructure, and maintain commitment over decades, even superpowers struggle to dislodge you. Russia sees validation for its own strategy of supporting resistant actors in Syria and elsewhere. The Lebanon case becomes a teaching example in capitals from Moscow to Beijing. Patient investment in asymmetric networks can outlast episodic American pressure. This represents a fundamental shift from 1990s assumptions about American primacy when it seemed inevitable that Washington's advantages would translate into outcomes. The 21st century reality is more complex. These consequences are already unfolding, but they raise the critical question: if America's current approach cannot succeed, what are the alternatives? Understanding why the current strategy fails naturally leads to the question, what could work? The answer reveals as much about American domestic politics and alliance commitments as it does about Lebanon itself. Scenario 1. Strategic acceptance. The first option is accepting Hezbollah as a permanent feature of Lebanese politics and working toward pragmatic accommodation. This would mean dropping demands for disarmament, accepting the organization's political participation, and focusing instead on preventing escalation and maintaining basic stability. The advantages are significant. Policy would align with reality rather than fight it. The contradiction with Israeli security needs diminishes. Deterrence becomes the goal rather than elimination, which Israel has quietly accepted anyway. Economic engagement becomes possible without impossible preconditions that were never going to be met, but the obstacles are formidable. Hezbollah remains designated as a terrorist organization by Washington, making formal accommodation domestically toxic. Israel would oppose any explicit acceptance, even if it practices implicit acceptance. Gulf Arab states would view this as American capitulation. Perhaps most importantly, accommodation sets a precedent for dealing with other Iranian-backed groups across the region. Yet elements of this are already happening beneath the surface. American diplomats maintain indirect communication channels with Hezbollah through intermediaries. Post-2006, implicit understandings limit escalation and define boundaries neither side crosses. The question isn't whether de facto acceptance exists, it does. The question is whether it can ever become official policy. The answer appears to be no. Scenario 2. Sustained pressure without breakthrough. The most probable scenario is the least satisfying. America continues current policy without fundamental revision, maintaining pressure while accepting limited results. This involves periodic diplomatic initiatives that generate headlines but little change. Economic sanctions remain in place, providing appearance of action. Support continues for anti-Hezbollah factions too weak to matter. The commitment is never sufficient to force fundamental change, but enough to claim engagement. The result is frozen conflict. Lebanese state decay continues uninterrupted. Periodic escalation risks emerge and are managed without resolution. Iran's position gradually strengthens by default as the only party with sustainable commitment. This path satisfies domestic political requirements. Washington appears tough on Iran without risking direct confrontation, but it achieves none of the stated objectives. Lebanon continues deteriorating. The humanitarian crisis deepens. The country becomes even more dependent on Hezbollah's parallel systems as state institutions atrophy further. This scenario postpones difficult decisions rather than making them. It's strategically incoherent but politically viable, which often proves decisive in policy selection. Scenario 3. Escalation through Israeli action. Through Israeli action, the third possibility is Israel attempting to fundamentally degrade Hezbollah through major military operation with tacit or explicit American support. Recent Israeli strikes on Syrian and Lebanese territory suggest this option remains under active consideration in Tel Aviv. The logic is straightforward. If diplomatic and economic pressure cannot work, perhaps military force can achieve what other instruments cannot. The risks, however, are enormous. Hezbollah possesses over 150,000 rockets capable of overwhelming Israeli missile defenses and causing unprecedented civilian casualties across Israel. Major conflict could trigger complete Lebanese state collapse, creating massive refugee flows and power vacuums. Regional escalation could involve Syria, Iran directly, and Iraqi militias, a multi-front war with unpredictable dynamics. And the 2006 war already demonstrated the fundamental problem: tactical military victories don't translate into strategic success against embedded resistance organizations with local legitimacy. Even if Israel could militarily degrade Hezbollah's capabilities, uncertain given the force's entrenchment, the underlying political and sectarian dynamics that empower the organization will remain unchanged. This option becomes more likely if Iran crosses the nuclear threshold, fundamentally altering Israeli threat calculations. But the costs make it a last resort, not a preferred strategy. Scenario 4. Lebanese collapse and reconstruction. The final scenario involves complete Lebanese state failure, creating conditions for international intervention and fundamental restructuring. Total economic collapse, government disintegration, or humanitarian catastrophe might theoretically justify international administration or reconstruction under entirely new political arrangements that limit Hezbollah's structural role. The problems are immediately apparent. No international consensus exists for such intervention. Libya and Syria offer cautionary examples rather than successful models. Hezbollah would likely survive state collapse better than traditional institutions, emerging relatively stronger. Iran would actively resist any intervention threatening its position, and regional actors lack appetite for the military commitment such operations require. This scenario is possible as outcome but unlikely to achieve American objectives even if it occurs. The most probable path. The realistic projection is continued muddle through. Gradual Iranian advantage accumulates. Periodic crises emerge and are managed rather than resolved. American attention eventually shifts toward higher priorities: China competition, European security, domestic concerns. Lebanon becomes a managed problem rather than a solvable one. Not success, not decisive failure, just permanent complexity that outlasts American attention spans. Each scenario reveals the same underlying reality. America has no politically acceptable way to achieve its stated objectives in Lebanon. The Lebanon case is not an isolated policy failure. It's a symptom of a broader strategic misalignment between American objectives and Middle Eastern realities. Understanding what this means requires stepping back to see the larger pattern. Return to the opening paradox. Why would sophisticated American strategists pursue an approach with structural obstacles to success? The answer isn't incompetence. It's constraint. American policy toward Lebanon is shaped less by what would work than by what is politically possible in Washington, acceptable to Israel, and consistent with broader maximum pressure on Iran. These constraints produce strategies that can be defended in congressional hearings and alliance meetings, but cannot achieve their stated objectives on the ground. This reveals something deeper about contemporary American foreign policy. The gap between rhetoric and achievable outcomes is widening. The Lebanon case demonstrates that 21st century power competition increasingly favors patient actors willing to invest in resilient, locally embedded networks over traditional powers, projecting influence through state-to-state relationships and economic leverage. Iran's success in Lebanon isn't primarily about resources. Tehran is operating under crippling sanctions with a fraction of America's budget. It's about strategic patience, willingness to accept costs over decades, and sophisticated understanding of local political dynamics that allows building structures designed to survive external pressure. America's challenge isn't confined to Lebanon or even the Middle East. It's adapting to a world where traditional tools of statecraft, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, financial pressure, and alliance networks work less reliably against non-state and sub-state actors with committed external sponsors. The question isn't whether America's Lebanon Gambit will fail. That trajectory is largely set. The question is whether American strategy will adapt to new realities or continue pursuing approaches designed for a world that no longer exists. Lebanon is a test case. The results suggest that adaptation remains elusive, constrained by domestic politics, alliance commitments, and conceptual frameworks that assume American advantages translate more readily into outcomes than contemporary realities allow. What happens in Lebanon won't stay in Lebanon. The lessons are already being studied and applied, from Taiwan to Ukraine, from Syria to the South China Sea. The real lesson from Lebanon isn't about Iranian strength or American weakness. It's about the changing nature of power itself. In the 21st century, the ability to survive pressure may be more strategically valuable than the ability to apply it. And that shift is reshaping not just the Middle East, but the entire international order.